Welcome everyone. We're just going to give it 1 minute to allow everybody to enter the webinar. Okay, hello everyone and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. You just joined the She Can Code Why Neurodiversity is a Benefit to Your Team live webinar. I am your host, Kaylee Batesman, the Content Director at She Can Code. For those tuning in who aren't familiar with us, She Can Code is a global community with a mission to close the tech gender gap. We use content, marketing and events to engage, inspire and attract more diverse communities to the tech sector. Now, before I introduce our speakers, please note we have a live Q&A session running today. So please submit your questions throughout and we will try and get to them at the end. So my wonderful guests for today are Di Maxfield-Twine, CPO at Triple Dot Studios, Kirsty Garshon, Associate Director at Harnham, and Shelley Vasey, Head of Talent Diversity and Inclusion at Oxbotica. Welcome, ladies. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to kick off with some quick intros from each of you, please. So, Di, can we start with you? Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your company?
Absolutely. I'm Di. I'm the CPO of Triple Dot. I have been with Triple Dot for a year. It's been a whirlwind, amazing year. We've had huge growth during that year, gone from 200 to 500 people. We've just been named as the Financial Times #1 fastest growing company in Europe. So company's doing amazingly well. We're having a great time. Before that, I was at Superbet for 2.5 years. Superbet is a Romanian headquartered gambling business. And before that, I was at Paramount, Viacom, for 10 years, where I led HR, legal, communications and editorial standards across UK, Northern, Eastern Europe. So that's me.
Fabulous. And Kirsty, yourself.
Hello everyone, so I'm Kirsty. I work for a company called Harnham, and what we do is specialise in placing data, analytics and engineering professionals across the globe. I am one of the associate directors here and have been here for 9 years, so of quite a long time. I started as a graduate and worked on the permanent side, and now I lead our contract function for the UK. I guess a little bit about me. I studied law at university and I'm particularly interested in diversity. So I'm actually our Global Chief Diversity Officer here. A number of personal reasons, very interested in inclusion, diversity as different programs. And I think it's a great thing to be able to support. So I personally identify as being dyslexic and dyspraxic. And so I'd love to champion causes like this.
Lovely, thank you. And Shelley, yourself.
Hi, thanks Kaylee. Hello everyone. My name's Shelley Vasey and I work with Oxbotica as their Global Diversity, Inclusion and Belonging Director. I've worked in IT services and consulting since leaving university, from really big IT resellers through to small software startups. I've been with Oxbotica for about 4.5 years now, and I've seen our neurodivergent community double in size over the last 18 months. So we're now about 320, 330 people. I chair our diversity panels and work with our voice groups to amplify their initiatives. And I'm also the very proud mum of a son who's incredibly talented, not that I'm biased. He has neurodivergent needs, and I'll continue to shine the spotlight through my work and my own personal agenda, both on neurodiversity and also on gender equity. I want to share that I share my own personal thoughts and lived experiences today, and I'm representing my own opinions in the stories that I want to share.
Wonderful, amazing. Thank you, Shelley. So today we're discussing how neurodiverse tech talent can give companies a competitive edge and what more businesses can do to foster an inclusive environment where everyone can thrive. So we're going to jump straight in with the questions for today. So the first question we're going to ask, what are the benefits of hiring a neurodivergent tech workforce? Shelley, we'll kick off with you.
Thanks, Kaylee. I think taking a step back, first of all, in terms of defining what neurodivergence actually is, the way we've described people has really evolved, in my opinion. It's not binary anymore. So if you think about your brain like your footprint or your fingerprint, it's really unique to you. So if you look at a recently published fact, for example, of 80% of us are neurotypical and 20% of us are neurodivergent, according to Fox and Partners in May 2022. That makes up a whopping 6.5 million of us that are neurodivergent, given there are approximately, I think it's 32.8 million people currently in the UK at work. That's a huge talent pool. So I think to answer firstly what the benefits are, no one's brain is any worse or better. We're all simply different on many, many levels. One of the benefits, in my opinion, is loyalty. So in an open letter published in 2021, so Richard Branson, founder of the Virgin Group, sure you've all heard of him, mentioned that the world needs a neurodiverse workforce to help try and solve some of the biggest problems of our time. So employers who have opened their doors to a neurodiverse workforce have found, for example, that autistic employees, for example, have a retention rate of up to and above 90%. So loyalty, I think that neurodiverse employees bring unique experiences and skill sets to our companies. So diversity of all kinds contributes to creativity, innovation, and competitiveness. Again, in my opinion, the greater the diversity of your staff, the more unique the ideas and perspectives you'll be able to bring to any given problem. And that includes neurodiversity. Neurodiverse companies have been proven to outthink and outperform heterogeneous spaces. And also, you know, thinking about people with dyslexia, for example, often they have average or above average intelligence in terms of creative skills and creative thinking skills. So they tend to have really strong problem solving and spatial reasoning capabilities. And this allows them to see varieties of solutions to one particular problem. I think for me, in short, I believe overall retaining and recruiting from a neurodiverse talent pool leads to better business results, more productivity, and it impacts the bottom line. So the more businesses can do to really look at progressive workplace inclusion for people of all backgrounds, not just neurodiversity, essentially enhances business performance. I think for me at Oxbotica, we're an autonomous software organization. Our question is unanswered. So nobody globally has arrived at level 5 autonomy yet, okay? In our opinion, we'll arrive at that answer quicker and in a safer way through attracting and retaining a diverse team member landscape. So we're openly inclusive as a culture. So let's not forget in answering this question that deep and disruptive tech, STEM and STEAM, as now the arts align, is known to be typically highly neurodivergent. So I think that answers it in terms of my case.
And I love the fact there that you spoke about intelligence, because there's that misconception, isn't there, that neurodiversity and intelligence are somehow linked, which is just so not true. And you even mentioned in there Richard Branson being, you know, a famous dyslexic who, you know, happened to say he thinks that neurodivergent people, they're really good at business because they don't get lost in the details, they can see the bigger picture. And he's a perfect example of that. Kirsty, I can see you nodding away there. What do you think?
I think wanted to add to that, and in that a lot of organizations want the best talent, right? And 48% in the UK of the working population identify as being neurodivergent. And so Shelley definitely highlighted something that I'm so passionate about in terms of not just hiring diverse talent, but retaining and inclusion. If you are, if you're essentially looking at hiring, but maybe don't look to have inclusive policies around people that are neurodivergent, then essentially you're excluding 50% of the potential working population. Let alone, you know, that thought leadership in your team, and just lessening the talent pool that you'd be able to attract.
Yes, and the fact that you just said hiring, but not having policies, in place is absolutely right. I think some companies, they think, oh, you know, that's something that we'd love to work on, and actually it's a bit more than just thinking we'd love to increase our talent pool in that area. You really need to think about the office, the environment, the things that you know, might affect those people. It might be the tiniest things, you know, background noise and buzzing lights, or it depends on the person, obviously, but just being more aware of those things. It's far more than just we'd like to increase our talent pool in that area. Di, yourself.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. I think when people start to think about reasonable adjustments and how we can create those inclusive cultures, I think people sometimes think, oh gosh, that sounds difficult, or that sounds challenging, or that sounds expensive. And I think exactly to the point you just made, it can be really simple things, like noise cancelling headphones for those environments, for, you know, making sure careers pages or things people are working on have not got the flashing lights. Obviously, to Shelley's earlier point, every single person is different, but there are some really, and it is usually really simple, effective things that can help. And I know we've worked with our occupational health, and we found our occupational health amazing at helping us with those reasonable adjustments. So they are, have been very easy to make where we've needed to.
I completely agree. We had an episode on our podcast recently about empathy in business, and I think that feeds so well into this. One of the ladies on the podcast, she said, I had to make a change in the office layout, and I had to move some of my team around, and it really did affect one person. And she said, even though I thought it was the smallest thing, she said, just speaking to him to make sure that he was happy where he was going and that I was still going to get the most out of him, meant that he could approach her on the bigger things, you know, that would happen down the line. She said, I know it seemed like the tiniest things, but if I broke that trust with him and changed his working environment, I wasn't going to get the most out of him. And that empathy in business leads so much into this conversation, because as Shelley said right at the start, everybody's different, and it affects people in different ways. Kirsty, does hiring neurodiverse tech talent give companies a competitive edge with measurable results, do you think?
100%. So Shelley, I think, referred to this in her response initially, but diversity of thought brings diversity of idea, thinking, approach, etc. And so that can be in a proactive way, but also can be in a way to mitigate any damage. So examples being, if we're saying that 48% of working population, let alone the general population, identify as being neurodivergent, then having people from neurodivergent backgrounds or neurodivergent thoughts will essentially help that company to be able to target those people. Because I think everyone doesn't always think the same, and I think that's the whole point of this. But essentially, you can just speak about things from your personal perspective. And if the team don't currently already have that thought process or understanding, then essentially that can definitely add benefit. And so ultimately, it definitely can help with things like targeted marketing campaigns, approaches, but then also preventing things like brand damage and pointless marketing campaigns. I know, for example, if I got a really long email or something that was quite lengthy and I wasn't in the right space, I probably wouldn't read it. Whereas maybe if somebody sent me personally a video, then it's a bit more interactive. I might actually read it or listen to it in the car while I'm driving home. And so those kind of smaller nuggets of ingesting the same information definitely help tech companies to be able to target their consumers, whether it be business to business or a B2C, a lot more effectively. And I think as well, allowing the other team members to be exposed to difference in thought can definitely help as well. So not only in terms of the consumer and the profit line overall, but definitely can help to upskill team members as well, that might think like quite similarly, I would say. So it's definitely helping to tap into kind of different markets, but essentially overall increasing return on investment.
Yes, and all obviously a huge advantage to a company. Richard Branson, you saying there about having diverse thoughts. And Richard Branson, I think he's not the only one, refers to them as superpowers. So yeah, absolutely an advantage. And Shelley, I can see you nodding in agreement with Kirsty.
Well, two things there, actually. We have a set of guiding leadership principles and values. And when it comes to diversity, we have actually named it as a superpower, with inclusion and then belonging being the cultural element, to inclusion being our action. So I think, just talking to Kirsty's point there, I think we've also got to take a step back as leaders to look at our audience, to listen to what that audience needs. So it's all very well saying we increase return on investment, productivity, diversity of thought, but if the audience that you're looking to attract, or the audience that you're looking to serve, isn't asking for the same things, there's a disparity there. So I think those are two things for me to add into this.
Yes, I love that. Yeah, it's and I suppose as well, Shelley, you have a group, a networking group at your company, and it's just making sure that you understand the needs. As you said, it's so much more than just thinking we want to increase that talent pool. You have to understand everybody's needs and how you can implement them. Di, what are your thoughts? Do you think that neurodiverse tech talent gives companies a competitive edge?
Yeah, I was just reflecting on a report I think I read from, it was JP Morgan Chase, and it was there, I think it was Autism at Work scheme that they'd run. And I think they found that there was fewer mistakes made by that autistic population. And I think the productivity, I'm sure it was 90 to 140% more productive than a neurotypical population. So, I mean, that kind of speaks for itself from an ROI perspective.
Yes, yes. And as Shelley said right at the start, actually, as well, when you think of the community, you think loyalty is the word that comes to mind, which is something that I've heard before, Shelley. Di, do you think that there are certain negative stereotypes when it comes to neurodiversity? I think there are certain stereotypes and assumptions that we kind of absorb from wider society, aren't there?
Yeah, I really think there are. And I think that leads to, those stereotypes lead to lack of understanding, they lead to discrimination, they lead to lack of inclusion. And I think, for all the reasons that we've really talked about, that is, a challenge for everybody. But I think it really plays to that skill shortage that, we've all talked about and we've all mentioned in this conversation. That is a really untapped market. And we've talked about the benefits that brings to an organization, and particularly that tech sector, where the skills of a neurodivergent workforce or not workforce really kind of the gaps are really what that population has from that problem solving creativity that we've talked about. So I think those stereotypes are a real barrier that we need to overcome as society, as organizations, as leaders within those organizations as well.
Yes, definitely. Kirsty, yourself, I see you smiling.
Definitely, it's really interesting for me, because I was speaking to a couple of my team this week about this, and there's so many different things that I think if organizations and people were aware that these myths, shall we say, weren't true, then actually I think it would help to create a bit more of an inclusive environment. So things like that I've heard, it would be maybe people that are neurodivergent can't be organized, or best suit like repetitive tasks, or things like neurodivergent individuals are quite similar. And actually some of these things couldn't be further from the truth. I think people are people, and I know Shelley mentioned this earlier, is that actually understanding that we all are different, approach things differently and think differently would eradicate all of those myths. And it's more about like the individual as opposed to thinking about these things in a negative way. And I guess one further thing I might add to this, sorry to go off on a bit of a tangent, but is that I think a lot of the issue with some of these stereotypes and the way that neurodiverse individuals have been thought about previously is the language is very negative. So it's very much around, what learning difficulties do you have? What challenges can you face? What additional adjustments? And ultimately, no one wants to be a burden. So all of that language adds to it. And I think if we can change the narrative in that respect, it would definitely help.
Yes, I completely agree with the language and looking at yourself more as an advantage. Caitlin Jenner, another famous dyslexic, she said the same. She said it's not just the perception of how people see other neurodivergent people, it's how she was talking about children, and she said it's how the children's perception of themselves as well that can be very damaging from language like that. So I completely agree there. Shelley, you're nodding away.
You think about the very word divergent.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. You think about the word divergent, it's got a negative connotation to it from the very onset. So I think it's language, and especially, and I'm talking about my son here, interpreting how the world thinks about him and how his friends think about him.
Yes.
You're starting from a negative standpoint before you've even gone into the workplace because of that very word. You're divergent.
Yes, exactly. And you're right. It's that before you even get into the workplace, you have that negative thought. And then when you get in the workplace, there can be, you know, things are not in place to help you, or people might have that stereotype already in their mind. So Shelley, on that note, what can employers do to help support neurodivergent employees?
This is a big one.
So that's a small question for you there, Shelley.
I guess I want to start this with just a high level stat. So according to the Neurodiversity Index, 72% of employees, wouldn't disclose their neurodiverse condition within the first year of their employment. And I want just the audience to take a moment and think about this question. If you broke your arm, you'd go to hospital and put a cast on it, and you'd wait for your bones to mend. So why is it that 72% of our workforce wouldn't disclose their condition within their first year of employment? That really blows my mind. So I think it's important to add here, and also go back to what one of the other panelists mentioned, that remember, if you're a line manager or a colleague or a member of a HR department, it's the team member's journey to share.
Yes.
So with this, and with protective characteristics in mind, you really should allow the team members to walk their own journey in their own time. And once that employee reaches out for help, you can then understand what you can do to support going forward. So I thought that was quite important to caveat first of all. For me, I'd encourage team members to bring their whole self to work and nurture a safe space in which, in terms of culture, so that anyone's able to feel safe and comfortable to share their own background and experience, to know that they're not going to be judged. So things like aiming to reduce stigma and negative stigma, and I'm going to talk about, what Kirsty just said as well. Stigma remains around neurodivergence needs, and I think she said, nobody wants to be different. And I think just a story for me to share. I remember deep in COVID times, we had a parent with a son who had learning difficulties and quite severe divergent needs. And via Zoom every day, Dad and his son would join the stand-ups most mornings. And over time, the whole team in this stand-up came to accept that Dad and his lad would be on this call. And it became part of the norm. So it was destigmatized. It's difficult for Dad at first because he was like, oh gosh, I've got this professional persona, but I've also got this part of my life that I need to bring my authentic self to work. And over time, and as COVID progressed and we were all nomadic and worked at home, it just became the norm. So for me, destigmatize, understand your audience, again, saying it again. We've got 2 ears and 1 mouth. Use them in that ratio. Listen to what your employers are asking for and saying. I think also one of the things that I could really be a strong advocate from and for is rolling out a neuro-inclusive recruitment process. So make reasonable adjustments. Put on your adverts and state you have a neuro-inclusive lens. So your recruitment process encompasses and wants everyone to have the best experience possible. So ask any applicant to share individual needs or suggest reasonable adjustments to make in advance of commencing the recruitment process, of course. Another one for me would be around training leaders and line managers to sometimes open up difficult conversations, give them the tools that they need to support their team members with neurodivergent needs. So it's understanding your person that you were talking to with the empathy podcast that you were talking about. It's understanding that actually sometimes line managers and leaders just don't have the equipment to open up these difficult conversations. So businesses create, in my opinion, they should be creating plans. These could be 2 to 5 year plans, so that others around them know it's important to you as a leader, but also your organisation. It's not a one-off tick box training exercise. Another one for me could be to seek out neurodiverse champions and allies and spin up voice groups and ERGs and business ERGs. So create communities where discussions can take place in a safe space, plant seeds, push cultural acceptance and destigmatization. I think one thing for me to note, and this is as a parent here, there are huge inequalities in access to all health services because of social and cultural difference. Waiting lists operate everywhere, especially for conditions such as ADHD and those from an autism spectrum condition point of view. So think about privilege as an employer. Who gets the front of the queue? Services for adults with dyspraxia and dyslexia, for example, are almost entirely absent. What about their talent pools? So I think for me as well, employers that offer EAPs should also start looking to introduce or enhance diagnosis and support options with their offerings. So not only for the team member themselves, but their wider dedicated family as well. So yeah, that's just in my opinion.
Yeah, so there's a lot to do then, Shelley. I love the fact that you spoke there about the line manager and giving them the tools to be able to do what they need to do, because I think you're right. If it's left just to the line manager and they haven't had any training or tools, they're just going to leave it. They don't know what to say. They don't want to offend somebody, and they'll just sidestep it and make that person feel like they're not welcome, and maybe not on purpose, until that talent leaves because nobody has had the courage or the tools to address it. Di, you're nodding along. I can see you there. What else do you think employers can do?
I think just picking up on some of the points Shelley made, those extra services are something that we've introduced at Triple Dot. We have really tried to enhance the EAP offering, our private medical cover, our occupational health to cover those services for exactly the reason that Shelley mentioned. They are difficult. The waiting lists are long, and that is something that we've proactively done here. I think the other thing in that line manager point, because often you can give training to your line managers, but there is still that level of sometimes panic, sometimes I just don't know what to do. So we've also looked at mentorship, so that there is someone who can really help employees. And sometimes we never want a bridge between manager and employee, but someone who can, enhance and support those conversations. Because what we found is sometimes there's unwritten rules in an organization, and those unwritten rules are what is difficult. They're difficult for absolutely everybody when you're new, but particularly I think for someone who is neurodivergent, they can be particularly challenging. So we found that mentor relationship really kind of helpful in those situations as well.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Kirsty, how can neurodiverse employees harness their superpowers, as we say at work?
So I think, firstly, I'd say putting themselves in the consumer's shoes. So user experience, etc., is obviously really important when designing products, and also when looking at how an organisation can benefit the population, generally speaking. So essentially just thinking about things from their personal perspective and how they would want to be approached, or what they might want if they were going to use that product, just simply put, very, very simply initially. But also, I guess, from prior to that, speaking to their managers, and I think just going back to both Di and Shelley's points, is that organisations, of course, need to seek understanding of what these superpowers are before employees are able to harness those. But essentially being able to communicate to their managers, or whether it be mentors or points of contact within the organisation, to explain, look, these are the things that actually I'm not particularly comfortable with, or I don't want to do for these reasons. But actually, these are my strengths, and I can do double in this area. And I think being open about that and being able to communicate that is half the problem. However, that being said, I'm very aware that this comes after the seeking understanding, because of course you need to feel comfortable to be able to express some of these things, particularly if you feel vulnerable about them. So that's number one. But then in addition to that, I think what that means for someone, I guess, in terms of harnessing those particular points, is that I think back to the first point that Shelley spoke about was loyalty, is that if you are harnessing these superpowers and you do feel comfortable within that, you're only going to continue to do so. So it's I don't have any stats around this, but I definitely know it's just a psychological thing. If you feel good about something that you're doing, then you're going to keep doing it. And I think it might be habit blocking, actually. I mean, that's what that is called. So if you do feel good about something that you're doing, you're going to want to keep doing it. And so I think part of that is, again, communicating to the organisation, actually, this is something I love doing, I want to keep doing it, I don't mind, it's not repetitive for me, or actually I like the diversity in what I'm doing, I don't want to do the same thing every day. So I think those are my main 3 points in that area.
And I love the fact that you said communicating the strengths and just knowing your strengths and being able to communicate them back to your manager is important to any employee, but definitely if you're neurodivergent, to be able to say, these are my strengths and this is what, you know, puts me above others in some situations, and just knowing them and be able to communicate them is so important. Shelley, any thoughts on that? What do you think about harnessing superpowers at work? What more can employees do?
I think at the end of the day, we've all got to take a step back and, in a psychologically safe space, allow the identification of those superpowers in the first place. And that relationship between line manager or team member has to be one of safety and trust. So you can put as many initiatives in place as you wish. If there isn't that psychological safety where an employee can talk to an employer in a safe space and bring their, and I talked about this, bringing your whole authentic self to work, nothing's going to work. So you've got to empower your line managers to have those difficult conversations, to make mistakes. We all make mistakes. It's repeating those mistakes when it comes a problem. So even if, you know, you're supporting people and you're helping them and you're developing them, if that employee doesn't feel that they can be their true authentic self, it won't work.
Yes, absolutely. And Di, I wanted to ask you about obviously superpowers at work, but I wanted to ask you, do you have any advice for neurodivergent employees that are struggling at work? You already mentioned you have a great mentorship program at Triple Dot. I'm assuming that's a good place to start. But what if companies don't have that? Where do they go?
I think with lots of diverse groups, that mentorship and that advocacy is super important. And I think whether that's formal or you are able to seek that out informally, I think that is something that is, you know, really beneficial. It is always easier for someone to speak for you than to speak for yourself. It just is, by the very nature of it. So I think that advocacy is really important. And I think, like we've talked about, really playing to those strengths, and really finding ways for you and in turn the organisation in some way to celebrate those strengths, those achievements, those differences. I think celebration is something we've seen that's been really successful. And that was actually driven by our employees, and that came from suggestions from our employees as well. So that was something we've done that's been really successful. But I think kind of trying to make employees trying to push that forward, with whether that be themselves or through their mentors, their allies, their advocates, I think is a good idea.
Yes, that's a great point, because I saw somebody put a question in, actually. Somebody said, I've kept my neurodiversity hidden from my employer, but I feel like I'm struggling. Any advice on asking for support? And both yourself and Shelley, Shelley, you mentioned about finding a safe space and how important that is, and who to go to. Kirsty, yourself, do you have any advice for neurodivergent employees that might be struggling?
I think it doesn't also necessarily need to be, let's say, for example, if you are also aware of somebody else that might share a similar challenge, or I think in teams, for example, it might be something that one of your colleagues might have said to you, oh, they're struggling with X, Y, or Z. If you find some sort of commonality, then I think a lot of the time people feel uncomfortable to approach their line managers with the front that actually I'm neurodivergent, whereas actually if it's just a challenge, it's just a challenge that's being faced, and then that might help you, I guess, to be able to say, look, this is something that I'm experiencing, I notice that this person's also experiencing this. What can we do to help alleviate that? Or again, even if there's a solution that works for you and that also works for that similar person, then you can say that. But that might be I guess an alleyway into that conversation, as opposed to you coming with the front that actually I'm neurodivergent and this is potentially what's causing this. Let's deal with the initial issues, what challenges are that you're having, and then segue into that.
Yes, definitely. And Shelley, I wanted to ask you a little bit about what more can be done to raise awareness of neurodiversity in the workplace. I've just seen a really interesting question come in that ties into that. Someone said, I'm neurodivergent and I agree that companies should be putting more support systems in place, but there's a risk of pigeonholing divergent people. I want to be seen for my talents and not for being neurodivergent. And I suppose, what do you do there? How can companies raise more awareness of neurodiversity in the workplace without pigeonholing people?
Education. So I want to circle back about my notes about the industry I work in, and then I'm going to come and answer that question. So stereotypically, if you asked a random person in a pub or a stranger in a park, typically the industry I work in is seen as neurodivergent, okay, deep tech, high tech. So from my own point of view, it's about education. Not all people with autism want to work in STEM, and not all people in STEM are autistic. So remember, if you've met one person with dyspraxia or dyslexia, you've met one person with dyspraxia and dyslexia. I mentioned at the start, your brain is like your fingerprint and it's unique to you. So make sure that you know, and those around you know, just because you've spoken to one person, that you know one person, that you're a mum to a child, or you've done some research or attended a course, you've met one person. We're all on a journey of discovery, and I think it's so important not to assume and not to pigeonhole yourself. You want to be seen for the unique talents that you've got, not because of your neurodivergent need. You have unique talents. So it's challenge the stereotypes and challenge the bias from within you as an individual, but also within the community that you work with. I think raising awareness for the community in the workplace in general, and I hope that answers that person's question. I think launch and drive voice groups. So I'm going to go back to one of the other answers. That person might find it difficult to go to their line managers, but if they're aware of champions, ambassadors, educators, if they're aware that everyone in the business has gone through some type of fundamental training of a whole team, not just a hiring manager or a leader or an exec member, it would make them feel safer. Because let's face it, not a lot of us would want to go to our line manager and expose our true selves, but they would in a safe space with a champion or an ally.
Yes, because I can see someone here actually saying, how do I put it in a cover letter or a CV? But you haven't even met your employer yet, and you don't know if that's a safe space. How would you even go about that?
I think to answer that question, that's a really good question, because as a team member that perhaps is looking for a job move or change, I would actively go out and source organisations that make those statements, make those reasonable adjustments, make that effort to say, we have a neuro-inclusive lens. Come and talk to us about what you need as part of your recruitment process. Another thing that we've done is produce hints and tip sheets. So for all team members focused on how to support and understand our wide communities. So they're not just part of our neurodiversity, physical diversity voice group. There's hints and tip sheets. There's hints and tip sheets on the backs of toilet doors. There's educational wikis that we share a lot of information of. So I think producing things like hints and tip sheets. Another thing that we're quite proud of is this year we're going to launch support cafes. So if you imagine the concept of going into a Costa Coffee or wherever, and you hear somebody talking about a topic that is of interest to you, you can become part of that discussion topic. And in a safe space, you can identify behaviours that are acceptable and not acceptable in a support environment, in a support cafe. So things that work for us, for example, we have every month we have 1 or 2 lunch and learn sessions, and they're run by team members that live and breathe their experiences. So they're living stories. So for example, in the last 6 months, we've run a session or a number of sessions on what ADHD is, how it's diagnosed, how it affects people in the workplace, things like late diagnosis and misdiagnosis for women, for example, related to hormones and the menopause. So again, another way that I would suggest companies can really shoot that lens deeper and raise that awareness is by allowing people in a safe space that want to and volunteer to shine their own spotlights through lived experiences. I think for me, in conclusion, I'd ask a question. How can my difference be understood? And how can someone understand that another person's experiences of the world are radically different to mine?
Yeah.
And that person might look and appear normal through techniques such as masking. I think the entire team member landscape in a business should be aware, in my opinion, for how neurodivergent people experience the world, and then hopefully challenge these stigmas, challenge the normal workplace environments and practices until culturally it becomes accepted that we experience the world very, very differently. I wrote a thought piece a little while ago, and I mentioned that whilst we can never truly know each other in the workplace, it can be a real pleasure and joy to go on a journey in order to try. So for me personally, it's breaking down those stigmas. It's giving people that ability to shine a light on their own individual journeys and accept that just because you look the same, everyone is different.
Yes, exactly. And you mentioned their late diagnosis. Somebody has popped a question in here about they've had a late diagnosis of dyslexia in adulthood, but because they don't quite understand it yet, their employer doesn't. They don't know what to request to ask for help. Di, I mean, you mentioned you've got great programs at Triple Dot, but what do people do you think if they've got a late diagnosis? They don't even know what to request. They don't know what's going to help them just yet. How do you know later in life what's going to help you?
We've had a couple of employees in this exact situation, and we found occupational health is what we've used. We've paired our employees up with occupational health, and they've told us what the individual needs, obviously working with that individual to diagnose and understand that. So we found those programs super helpful for our employees. And I think just going back to that other question that we were talking about, like the CV and how can someone do their CV? I think it is really like remembering the strengths that you bring and the strengths that, we're talking about individuals rather than a group, but we've kind of also said that this, neurodivergent group have skills that are sought after, have skills that really fills those gaps in the market. So I think it's really playing to and identifying those strengths and really pulling those through in CVs. And then again, to kind of Shelley's point about seeking out the organisations that will give support in other areas that are necessary. as well.
Yes, because Kirsty, you mentioned strengths as well, and somebody in here though is asking, there are people maybe with higher support needs such as autism who might not consider their condition to be a superpower. So what can be done to ensure that people with higher support needs aren't excluded from the conversation around neurodiversity in the workplace? I suppose as we've said throughout all of this, everybody has completely different needs. And it's not just, grouping everybody under putting them all under the same umbrella, isn't it? And just making sure that you learn about your team members and their individual needs.
Definitely. I think to this, for me, it sums up, I think, a bit about what Di was saying, and also Shelley, is that this all starts with seeking understanding. And I can't stress, it sounds like my point is the same, but I can't stress enough that the language that's used to seek understanding is really important. So, and I think we all do this, but saying something is going to be a challenging conversation is already putting in somebody's mind that it's going to be hard. Actually, it's just giving them the tools, which I think we all alluded to earlier in the day, in that, how can you have these conversations? How can you tease out these things that maybe people don't feel comfortable with? So for me, this not burden, but this responsibility sits with organizations to make sure that language that is used is either factual or positive. Because I think to the participants' question, how do we make sure that people that maybe don't consider themselves to have superpowers are included in the conversation? Actually, if the language that is used to tease out what needs that person has is positive, then they're going to feel comfortable to say whatever it is that they need. But in addition to that, it's not necessarily going to have to feel like a superpower. It's just going to be a strength, because regardless of how maybe we might all feel, sometimes we all do have our own individual strengths, whether you class it as an extreme strength at the level of a superpower, or whether you just describe it as this is something I'm good at and this is something I'm proud of. And again, it might not even be something you're particularly proud of, but this is something I know I can do. Let's put it on that, in that level. But in addition, I think sorry, I'm jumping around here, but somebody asked about what happens later in life if you've been diagnosed and maybe you don't know some of the things. I can only speak from my personal perspective, but I was only given diagnosis when I had finished all of my education in my final year of uni. And what I did then when I joined Harnham is I spoke about what I then learned, what I thought were coping mechanisms that other people just didn't do. So it could be I read my emails out loud because there's a delay between maybe how I'm reading something, but there's a delay, basically. I'm not actually sure what it is, but there's a delay between the two. So I will read my emails out loud. But essentially what that meant is that obviously for other people in the team, that maybe was not particularly helpful. But that was a coping mechanism that I had developed. And so what then I have been given is like software that will read things out for me, and so it just saves the process. But the coping mechanisms, I would say that maybe you might be aware of, those that would be a good start to, I guess, inform your employers of.
Yes, yeah, that is great advice. It's great advice to end on as well, because we're already out of time. But Di, Shelley and Kirsty, thank you so much for joining us today. It's such an important conversation, and one that we're going to continue talking about at She Can Code, because there's definitely, we've only scratched the surface today. So thank you so much to everybody listening. We're going to include this video on shecancode.io tomorrow, so you can catch it again if you wish. But thank you all ladies for coming along, and to our listeners, we hope to see you again on another webinar of ours in the future. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you, Kaylee. Bye.
Thank you.